I am not an optimist by nature. In fact, I have delighted in calling myself a pessimist for most of my life, mostly because the reactions I got from other people were entertaining. There are some reasons why this is the way I lean. Largely that growing up on an active military base meant that people came and went from my life quickly, and I was no stranger to tragedy. I grew up expecting things to go wrong, because when they did, I was not surprised. And when they didn't, I was pleasantly surprised. This is a good way to avoid disappointment, but not a good way to have an enjoyable life. Artistically, however, I had a strong streak of optimism and naive hope. Though I might expect so many things in my life to go poorly, when I started a new sketchbook, it felt like there was a whole world before me. What could possibly go wrong? The first time I jumped into 3D animation, worked with a drawing tablet, or tried painting, I was so excited because an infinite realm of possibilities lay before me. In my mind, I could see all of those potentialities, and I dove in with reckless abandon. And that right there got me into a lot of trouble. My name is Zach, and welcome to episode 71 of the podcast. Today, we are discussing the dangers of optimism. I know this might sound like a strange topic because positivity is a good thing, and I will certainly touch on that. What I'm going to be expanding upon primarily is an over-optimistic sense of things that plagues so many of us as artists, and how we can take that, temper it, and put it into a more productive place so that we can continue working on the things that we love. As usual, I'm going to explore what I mean by the topic and then go over how this might actually affect you as an artist. Though I'm going to start adding some closing thoughts and updates at the end of each episode now as well, so stay tuned for that. Feel free to check out the Discord and Patreon link below as we get started. Before we dive in though, I'd like to ask, what was this like for you as a young artist? Did you expect things to go well, to go poorly? What did that look like? Let us know in the comments below. Well, what do I mean by the dangers of optimism? Let's start with defining optimism, perhaps not the same way I usually do, as the way we use it in casual conversation will suffice in this instance. Culturally, we use the term optimism to mean looking at the positive in any given situation, seeking the good, or seeing the glass as half full rather than half empty. The term is tossed around in a positive light nearly always, with its counterpoint, pessimism, often receiving some manner of disdain or lack of love. Optimism is, for all intents and purposes, looking at the good and expecting good to continue coming forward. Hope is a natural partner to, or side effect of, optimism. So why would such a thing be a downside for an artist? In general, optimism is seen as a good thing, but I have seen it damage the artistic pursuits of many students over the years. The reality is, optimism and hope are necessary to do much of anything with art. But if they are alone in that task, if they are left untempered or naive, they alone might prevent you from continuing onward. Here is the basic story of how this often played out in my own teaching realms, my personal life, and going through art school. You, used in the broad sense here, not pointing fingers, you come upon a new thing artistically. Perhaps it's a new medium you finally got as a gift, or it's a new unit in a class where you get to use acrylic for the first time. Maybe it's a project you finally built up the courage to start, or maybe, just maybe, you are starting art for the very first time. In general, a wave of optimism surrounds you, showing you all the wonderful things that could be, all of the possibilities. Maybe acrylic will be your favorite medium yet. Maybe this class will solve all of your issues with anatomy. Maybe your parents will finally be proud of you if you land that job. And you might be able to see where this is naturally going to go. The reality, though, is that optimism is generally reinforced at the beginning of any new thing artistically. Excitement and adrenaline floods you, and you're able to work through some of those initial barriers. Also, learning the very basics of any new thing is often pretty quick. It's pretty easy to understand how lighting works or how to blend your basic colors, but difficulty will inevitably ensue. And inevitably, as you dive into the new aspect of art, things change. And after just a small amount of time often, that feeling will begin to wear off. You realize that, oh, it's going to take some work to achieve great things with acrylic paint. That anatomy is still hard, even though the class is helping. Invariably, you will be met with the reality of artistic pursuits, and the thin veneer set up by your optimism will begin to shatter. In so many cases, this is where I watched people walk away from their art. Their hopes and dreams for a particular pursuit ran into the brick wall of reality, and expectations kept aloft by optimism came plummeting to the ground. Perhaps this has happened to you, or maybe someone in a near vicinity to you. This has certainly been the case for me many, many times. I don't know how many projects I started in high school or college where, with a single friend, we got very excited about something, we started diving in, and inevitably, when the work got hard and the kind of excitement faded, we were left with a giant primed piece of masonite or a whole bunch of cardboard or styrofoam cut up into pieces to build miniatures and models and things like that. But we, when we were young, had a tendency to hit that wall and stop. I wish I could report that I was just wimpy and lazy as a kid, which I probably was in some ways, and that the youth of today are totally different. But human nature seldom changes, if at all, and when it does, it seems to change very quickly. And I watched this with countless students over the years, even all the way up to my seniors, 18 years old, students who were preparing, in some cases, to go on to art careers or art education. They would get involved in a piece so excited. I would look at their sketches with them, their ideas, talk it over, and part of my job as a teacher was always to try to temper their expectations, to prepare them for that disappointment. I know that sometimes this probably came off as being a little bit of a killjoy. They were so excited about things, but part of my job is not just to make them feel better in that moment, but to help prepare them for the reality. And most of the time, they would hit a wall, maybe an hour into the piece, maybe a week into whatever project it was they were working on. And usually they would walk away from it for a while. Most of my seniors wouldn't walk away forever, but I had a lot of middle schoolers and high schoolers and people that have done this in their personal life where they don't have to strive for a grade will often just walk away from it entirely. Art is hard, it takes a lot of time, and though your excitement kind of lies to you at the beginning through the optimism, it generally peters out pretty quickly. So what can you do? Do you dismiss optimism and embrace reality as a pessimist? No, absolutely not. I think the true best position likely exists between the two extremes. As Aristotle said, happiness is found in the mean between these two extremes. Pessimism keeps you aware of disappointment, aware of what could go wrong so you can sidestep it. But optimism gives you the hope to get started in the first place. Both are needed. But it seems from my experience that most artists lean toward that optimistic side, at least of the beginning of their journey and the beginning of any new pursuits. While pessimism can seem enticing, and I know that when you are young and being pessimistic about the state of things, the state of the government, of the world, of education, it can feel almost like you are mature, like you are beyond your years in how you're perceiving things. There's an attitude to pessimism. There is a natural naivety to pessimism. I saw this a lot again, and I exhibited this in myself for far longer than I should have. And I look back now with some level of disappointment on myself, thinking about how long I was pessimistic, how long I chose to expect bad things only, how long I gave in to the negativity. And the long-term result was simply that I made my own life worse. That things where I could have potentially pushed through, I chose not to avoid potential disappointment. And you could see here why that balance is going to be very important. This podcast is not about killing your optimism, nor is it about glorifying pessimism. It is about being aware of you and your tendencies and trying to hone in on something that is going to lead to good artistic progress, but more importantly, consistent joy. Well, do you try to keep hope and expectations out of your pursuits instead? Again, no, I think absolutely not. To make art is to hope. You have to think there is some manner of possibility things will turn out well, otherwise, why make that painting? Why sculpt that piece? Hope is an essential component of art in general, and it must be maintained like a precious little fire. Reese Roper, who sings for Brave Saint Saturn and Five Iron Frenzy, has said in some of their songs that the bravest thing of all is always hope. And it is one of those few lines that I hear in music, and it makes me tear up nearly every time. Hope is hard for me. Like I mentioned at the beginning of the podcast, growing up the way that I did, having this very dark, natural pessimism to me, hope is hard because hope leads to the potential for disappointment. And I have evidently had enough disappointments, or am so averse to it by nature, that I have just strived over the years to prevent disappointment. But especially as I got older, as I had a career, as I got married, as I had a kid, I realized that living a life where you avoid hope, or a life devoid of hope, is basically just not a life worth living. That hope is what gets you up in the morning. It allows you to push forward. And when I had that understanding from a more global perspective, it began to infiltrate every area of my life. So now, as I'm writing, as I'm putting videos together for YouTube, as I'm working on my artwork, there is always an innate sense of hope. And I'm not, I haven't done a 180. I'm not all of a sudden this crazy optimistic, very hopeful person. I am a natural born pessimist who tries to be a realist, so I'm just looking at things for what they are, and who dares to hope. And sometimes I am very disappointed by things, but sometimes I'm actually excited these days, and that's a lovely change in my life. Expectations are inevitable, it seems. We as humans form them for just about every interaction we have with anything. There is less danger in having expectations, and more danger in not being aware of them. All right then, let's move on to dealing with this. How can we handle our optimism and pessimism balance in our artistic lives? I'm searching for a better way to say this that doesn't sound so awkward, but let's just dive in. Be aware of your optimism and the things that it produces. Optimism will provide some insight and hope at the beginning of any endeavor. If you are able to dissect it, to pull out the individual pieces, you will find these kinds of things. Expectations. Whether you are aware of them or not, you have expectations for each of your works, each of your pieces. There is nothing wrong with this, as I mentioned earlier, but the more you are aware of your expectations, the more they can be a tool that works for you rather than against you. If you are honest with yourself, you can decipher your expectations. So maybe stop for a moment. Cast your mind back to the most recent piece that you started. What was your expectation? Was it different from the intended result? Perhaps you wanted it to be better, but expected it to be less? This can go so many places. I certainly have had pieces that have turned out better than I expected, though our pessimism will probably push us to this point where we expect a piece to turn out worse than it does. And then sometimes we make a self-fulfilling prophecy there. Expectations are strange in that they can be positive or negative, good or bad. You can expect a piece to fail and then can be happily surprised when it doesn't. Before thinking this is the ideal way to do things, however, I would caution you away from this particular perspective. We as humans tend to steer toward the things we anticipate. If you expect your piece to fail, subconsciously you might stir the piece there to prove yourself right. This sounds silly, but it does seem to happen psychologically, and if you start to do any research on it, you'll see that it's not something that is isolated to art, artists, and intentions only. This is a human thing that just seems to crop up here and there. In my work, I expect my pieces to be completed, to be accurate in their representation of whatever I was going for. I don't expect them to fail. In fact, when they do, I find it saddening. I hope they will be great, but I expect them to be satisfactory. And the way this actually kind of bears itself out in my artwork is that every once in a while I will take a look at the past 10 pieces that I've done. It's not always 10, but 10 is a good round number for what I'm going to talk about here. I'll take a look at my last 10 ink drawings, the last 10 sketches, last 10 paintings, and I try to isolate them into their own categories because our skills progress very differently in each of those arenas. If you're putting a ton of time into drawing and then you shift into a painting, it's rational to expect it to be less successful than your drawings were, though of course there is some cross-pollination in all of the artistic fields. I will take a look then at the last 10 paintings, let's say. I just started a slew of acrylic paintings recently. When I look at the last 10, I like to try to isolate how many of them did I meet my expectations on, how many of them exceeded expectations, and then how many fell flat. This allows me, when I look at the data, to have a more rational understanding and set of expectations moving forward. For example, there was a day, probably maybe 7 years ago, when I really started to get back into painting, where about 50% of my paintings did not achieve what I wanted. So that was kind of rough. When I sat down to make a painting, I would run into an inevitable situation where I had a 50-50 chance of this painting going well or poorly. Of course, in that moment, I would focus primarily on the poorly because that's how humans tend to operate, and that made it really hard to engage in the painting. A solution then is to focus on things that are more likely to yield success, so you can kind of stack the deck in your favor, as it were. Over time, that ratio has increased. I'm probably at about 8 out of 10 pieces now, painting-wise, that turn out the way that I want them to. Now, that said, I have one on my easel behind me, one of 3. I'm working on 3 acrylic pieces simultaneously. And one of them I'm pretty sure is not going to turn out well. I don't say that as a pessimist or as a, doom talker of any kind. It's just all 3 have about an hour of work, hour and a half of work into them, and one of them just is falling behind the others. The perspective that I put it together under, the particular composition, was not as powerful. It was not as beneficial to me. Sometimes a photograph doesn't translate to a good painting. So I knew that going in, but working on 3 of them simultaneously, I felt a little bit more comfortable. But that's even now. I have work in a gallery, I have a YouTube channel, I've taught painting for years, and I still sit at somewhere between 7 and 9, generally 8 pieces out of 10 turn out the way that I wanted them to. That still doesn't account for the fact that 1 or 2 out of that 8, or 1 or 2 out of that 8 generally surpass my expectations. I had a raven painting that I did recently that really turned out well. And I had a whale painting I did, I think in December, that was my first painting of its kind. The first painting where you have something underwater and above water simultaneously. There's some weird atmospheric things that happen in that situation. And it turned out far better than I expected. But we don't tend to focus on those things. So that's just a little snapshot of how this often looks in my personal life. When I look at my ink drawings, I could do the same thing, though I just have so many dozens of them with the back-to-back Inktober's doing so much work here on the channel. All of my robots, the dragons for Smogist. I probably had somewhere in the neighborhood of 200 completed ink drawings last year. And when I look at that, there were probably 20 or 30 out of there that didn't turn out well, but at that point, the math is just so much on my side that it's much easier for me to dive back in and to keep working. The next thing after expectations, though, is hopes. Hope is the high end of your desire for a piece or pursuit. Hope is essential to art making, as it is the allowance for things to go well. I'm not sure I would say you need to temper your hope. As long as you have irrational expectations, allowing your hope to be kind of crazy can actually be really beneficial. In the same way that you have rational expectations, but you have a little bit of fear of something going wrong, you should hope that things go really well. And in the same way that you can sometimes aim towards what you're expecting, you can sometimes accidentally or purposefully aim for that hope and actually achieve it. If your expectations became the same as your hopes, you are likely setting yourself up for disappointment, though. If you can be aware of both and honest with yourself about them, you can disconnect them. Now, expectations and hopes are, I think, fundamentally different things. Maybe sometimes they are, served to you as similar, and maybe they are similar, but expectation is kind of the rational, thought as to what a thing will be. Maybe it's not always rational, but an expectation is what you expect to happen. A hope is what you desire to happen. If you're allowing yourself to actually give in to some of the really positive aspects of being human, you're going to hope for good things, hope for better things, hope for positive change in your world and in your artwork. So separating the two, becoming really aware of them, can be super beneficial. I expect 8 out of 10 of my paintings to turn out well. I hope that 10 out of 10 will. I hope that each individual painting I work on will allow me to develop further skill, will teach me something new. And I even find hope in my failures. When I have something that fails to meet my expectations, I can still hope to glean something from that. Each failed piece that you have, that I have, is the potential for learning how to miss that pitfall next time. Allow your hope to be excessive, to push you forward, while you keep your expectations at a place that is more rational and sustaining. I think that is the trick here. That is what we should aim for. Building off of hope, sometimes that very sensation stretches into the future more dramatically and turns that hope into a dream. This is often something more substantial than a simple hope. You might hope your piece turns out well, but you might dream about making work that allows you to go professionally. Dreams are good as well, and in fact, I think I did a video at some point about the importance of having dreams and nurturing them. It might actually have been more on the fact that we all actually have a dream when it comes to art, but we're not all aware of it. I think for most artists, we hide our dreams. They scare us a little bit because reality is harsh. And we know that if we talk about them and share them, well, we risk much. In fact, many people don't like talking about their dreams in general because it almost feels like by talking about them, you make them real. And if it's real, then it can fail. If it's real, then it can betray you. Sometimes we trick ourselves into thinking that other people are going to mock us for it, when in fact, it's probably we have less confidence about our ability to achieve that thing. So sometimes you keep them close to your chest, hoping that you won't jinx them by making them public. Many artists are very hesitant to talk about their dreams, and I think we ought to start denormalizing this thought process. This again goes back to expectations. If your expectations are rational and known, then dream on. But I want to return for just a moment to that prior thought, that we should start normalizing the sharing of dreams. We are in a cynical culture, at least here in the US, and I think more broadly when it comes to the internet. The internet makes it easy to be cynical. You don't have to watch people's reactions when you mock something. Think of all the negative comments that show up on Instagram. In fact, it's probably the number one reason to avoid Instagram, is there is just so much negativity. I think a portion of that is linked to the fact that, when I was growing up, if you said something hurtful to someone, you were in their presence when you did it. That made you unable to avoid their expression, unable to avoid them lashing out back at you. And I think that built a certain temperance into most of us. Sure, there were still jerks who did terrible things, but you had to endure the terrible that you wrought in the world. And nowadays, it's just not quite the same. And so it's easy for people to be cynical. If you share something online and you tell people you want to be an author, you want to be a professional artist, you want to be a professional musician, you just want to learn a skill, you are going to run into people who are going to come at you with a negative attitude. Some of them are going to think they're helping you. Sometimes this happens in real life with your family, where they will try to steer you away from something toward a more rational dream from their perspective. This is agitating. Even knowing where it's coming from, it's still very agitating. There's going to be people online who don't think about it at all, and they just respond. And some will respond positively and some will respond negatively. But I think perhaps the largest subset of these people is going to be a mixture of people that wish they had done something, and so tearing down your potential to do that makes them feel better. Some are conscious of this, some are not. And some are just people who enjoy being mean to other people. It's easy to bully people online because you can leave a nasty comment, you can reply to something, and then you can just turn off notifications. You can log out of whatever you're on. You can ignore the presence of embarrassment or shame or guilt that you should feel in those scenarios. If you do something that is shameful, you should feel shame for it. If you're bullying people online, if you are knocking down other people's dreams, that just makes you a worse person. And I can pretty much guarantee it means that there's a piece of you that dislikes yourself because you haven't striven after, I don't know if it's striven or strove, or that's a hard word for me to past tensify. You haven't strived for what you really desired. So all that said, I think we as an artistic community should start being more supportive of dreams. We don't need to be irrational about it to tell everyone we run into that, like, yeah, you're good enough to be a professional. Some of them probably aren't. In fact, most of them probably aren't. But that's very different than encouraging someone's dream. You can be supportive of someone's desires. And in fact, almost everyone who pushes forward and attains something crazy, something wonderful, had a dream at some point that they pushed for. If we can encourage that, we will increase the amount of people that actually achieve dreams. But more than that, we'll encourage a positive community, a positive force in the world. Imagine if the vast majority of responses that start showing up online for people who are expressing artistic dreams are met with encouragement. How much more beautiful of a space does that become? So on that note, if you want to check out our Discord, we are working on building a small community like that. So feel free to check it out. It's in the description down below. And I know that this is just one tiny corner of the internet, but I do think that if we as an artistic community can start encouraging sometimes irrational dreams, that the world will be a better place and that the art will be more fun to engage in. The usefulness of these things and the way that they can be managed is also another aspect that I think we need to focus on. All of these things, expectations, hopes, and dreams, are individual components of your psychology, intrinsically linked to your optimism and perhaps your pessimism as well. They are all beneficial tools in your toolbox, and once understood and known, can be used to help you. The real problem here comes from not knowing yourself fully, from not understanding that you have underlying expectations and hopes that are driving you, leading you toward disappointment, and keeping you from doing the work that you want to do. This is hard. There is a reason that so many of the art talks here on YouTube and TED Talks and things like that that you'll run into in the professional world are focused on understanding yourself. You can't control all of the things outside of you. You can't control necessarily how long it's going to take to learn a skill. You can continue to practice, you can keep putting time and energy into it, but you can't always control how fast you metabolize a thing. It's kind of like you can control your diet, you can control your physical exercise, but you can't really control how fast you're going to build up muscle. Some of that's based on environmental things, a lot of it's based on your genetic makeup and your DNA structure and whatnot. The same is going to be true for art. But understanding more about yourself, both metaphorically and in reality, is going to be beneficial. The more you know how you lean. I know that I lean towards pessimism, so I have to push some optimism. I know that I have optimistic expectations when I engage in new art, so I try ferociously to pull back my expectations because I've had way too many times in my life of being so excited to dive into a new thing. I finally dive into it, it doesn't go exactly right, and I put it aside for months or years. For the first time, I am writing my novels because I was able to dismantle that and understand that my expectations can be as simple as just write every day. That's what it began as. It wasn't write a wonderful fantasy novel. It was just put something on the page every day. After I did that for 30 or 60 days, I was able to go, well, let's aim for 500 words a day, which then eventually became 1,000 words a day. And I'm now working on upping that to 1,200, mostly because if I can achieve that, I should finish the trilogy I'm working on by the end of 2025, which would be wonderful. But the same thing is true for a lot of other things. I just got back into miniature painting. I've been working on a lot of Warhammer miniatures. I tried to start this when I was a teenager, and because I didn't do any research, the internet was, not the place it is today. I don't think YouTube existed back then. It was very hard to learn things, so you kind of had to just struggle through on your own with that kind of stuff. And I gave it a couple hours, it didn't turn out the way I wanted, and I abandoned it. So now I'm 20 years later coming back to it, looking up lots of resources and watching videos and learning and practicing and tempering my expectations. And oh man, has it been fun. It's been so enjoyable. I have returned to acrylic paint rather than just oil because I was in an academic scenario where oil paint was seen as the real kind of paint to work with. This is what professional artists work with. Tempering my view on things and working with my expectations and how I function, I've come back to acrylic, and I find it far less stressful, which has yielded far more paintings. I'm now painting probably 3 or 4 times as many paintings a year as I used to because I've reduced my stress levels when it comes to it. So I can sit down and paint for 20, 30 minutes in an evening if that's all I have, and then I can just jump back in the next day. And especially because it's not oil, I don't have to worry about the viscosity of everything changing and the paint not being quite as malleable as it was the day prior. Understanding yourself is one of the keys that is going to allow you to stick to this thing that we call art for a long period of time. How to do that is probably a whole other conversation, but try to think about your thoughts behind things. Think about why you think the way you think. Think about thinking. If you're an artist, there's a good chance that you're an introvert, that you are fairly introspective, and this comes naturally for you. But if you're not one of those people that this comes naturally to, I would encourage you to think about your desires. Think about what you're aiming for with a piece of art. Think about what your goal is. The more you can, hone in on these things and define them, the better off you're going to be. And the last thing here is temper your optimism with the other side, or your pessimism with the other side. Once bolstered with some rational expectations, optimism can be a driving force that pulls you through your artistic journey. But the reality here is you should be aiming for that mean. If you are overly optimistic, then pull it back with some pessimism, but not enough to damage your joy. If you are pessimistic by nature, add in some optimism, enough to get you started on things and excited. We as humans have to work on ourselves almost always to get to a place where we are happier, where we're more satisfied. That work is hard, but it's satisfying and it's good for us, and it helps us get to a more full version of who we are. So, for my thoughts on this, I've actually given a lot as we've talked about it. I struggle with optimism. I struggle with hope. I don't know if this is the way that I'm built, my psychology, some trauma from early life, growing up, fairly isolated, coming home from school and your best friend has moved out of the country. Those kinds of things are hard, and I have little, thought that they didn't affect me. They must have affected me in some way. But I can't obviously draw a direct link to exactly why I think and process the way that I do. But I struggle with optimism. Fortunately for me, my wife is a boundless optimist, and we have tempered each other over time. She has come down a little bit and is a little bit more realistic about things. Thusly, she's far less disappointed, especially in people, because when people have treated her poorly in the past, it has come as an overwhelming thing because she has high hopes and expectations for humans to be good people. I, on the other hand, expect people to be terrible by nature. And so taking some of her optimism, I have more joy and happiness just in normal everyday life than I ever have before. And that's because I have tempered it. So it's a struggle for me, but I'm slowly working on it, and over time I've gotten a lot better. And I'm glad that I had a lot of this growth before I had a kid, because I would hate to put my natural tendencies into her. I want to help her sculpt out the way she wants to look at the world and hopefully do that with a more positive angle. Well, thanks for being here. I hope that this talk was beneficial for you, and I would love to hear in the comments below where you land on this spectrum, and if you find any of these things helpful. Thank you to my patrons as well, who are on the screen right now, and if you want to check out our Patreon, you can do that in the link below in the description. It gives you access to updates to some videos that are not here on YouTube. Sometimes it's sketchbook sessions or just, what I'm doing here in the studio, starting a new sketchbook, stuff like that. It also gives you the ability to vote on upcoming content, suggest topics for podcasts like this. So feel free to check it out. There is a free version that you can join on that doesn't give you access to everything. That way you don't have to feel like you're spending things right off the bat. And again, the Discord is linked below as well, and I would certainly encourage you, if you don't have an artistic community, to check that out. Well, have a good one, y'all. See you soon.